Hi, Stefan.
Hello.
So my name is Lelia, for the people who don't know me. I used to be a producer. I've done that for the last 12 years, and I've helped very small studios with very tiny budgets and very big studios. And I find that in my career, the hardest thing to take care of is actually the hosting. So I wanted to ask you, because you know very much about this, if you could help me with figuring out what kind of provider I can use. So maybe you want to introduce yourself?
Okay. Sure. Thank you. So I'm Stefan Idler. I'm the CTO of 𝗥𝗲𝗹𝗲𝘃. Been here with the company for 20 years. Since the very beginning, when it was just a single server assembled by us by buying different parts from different stores, going to the data center by public transport. And now suddenly I wake up and it's more than 10,000 servers worldwide, this global network, hosting many different games. Not just Ubisoft, as some people might have assumed, but all the big industry names and also voice providers and many others.
Nice, fantastic. Yep. That's the reason why I wanted to pick your brain, because you have the overview.
Yep.
So I guess the first question I always ask myself is, I don't know a lot about hosting. So what can I ask my hosting partner about? How can they help me with?
So to determine if your hosting partner is actually useful to you or not, from a games-related point of view, depends on a number of factors. One, they should be giving you advice on your hardware choices.
Okay.
They should be asking you the questions regarding the life cycle of your game, how many players do you expect, about your game server software, how many of them do you plan to run on an instance, what's optimization levels, so they can accurately determine the right hardware models and footprint for your game's development, beta and release.
Nice.
They should be giving you advice on your regions, like where do you expect your players to come from. They should be asking these questions to you.
Gotcha.
To better optimize where they should locate this infrastructure for you, and also determine if they need to make additional network connections or if there's any connectivity problems based on the region profile of your game. And they should be also talking about how to support you during this stage, during development, during the certifications, during the alpha beta test, and during release. Will there be a war room where they will be directly accessible to you? In your studio? Will there be 24/7 coverage, or is it just tickets, telephone, or Slack, or what's the means of communication? Because during the time that your game has these gates, these very important stages during its development cycle, you need your hosting provider to be a partner.
Yeah,
and stick along with you. And also, they should be displaying some knowledge, thinking ahead with you to look at your game's optimization, help you there, show their past experiences of hosting other games, and how that can help you to make a better and more successful game release.
Thanks. Thanks. That really helps, because I think you've mentioned a bit like the different steps in the production. So I find that when I make my games, usually I'll go and think about the hosting provider quite at the end of the project. But we know that in production practices, you want to try and test as early as possible. Can you help with this as well as a hosting provider?
Yes, and I think what you say is also correct, especially in the early days, so the first 10 years that we started as a company. That hosting question was the last thing on a game developer's mind. It definitely came at the end, because at the beginning, there was no hosting arranged by the game developers at all. It was just released into the wild and hope that the community starts hosting their own servers so people can play, but there was no afterthought or games as a service or live games model until, I guess, the earliest days of like a Battlefield 2, where they start taking some control of the ranking and experience of the players of the online game. So how can it be at an earlier point? Of course, as a game developer, you need to start thinking about it at an earlier stage, but your game or your hosting provider should think along, like giving you access to free proof of concepts, to trials, so you can, early in your development stage, you can already test with your development builds the different level of integrations that you would have to do, the different kind of products that you might be able to use, because from a hosting provider point of view, of course, you want to be able to offer different kind of products than just a server hosting to make it more attractive for a game developer to knock at your door earlier during the game lifecycle. Think, for example, like anti-cheat or stuff like matchmaker integrations, allocation-based platforms. And the advantages by having this contact early, it also allows for a lot more flexibility.
Yeah.
So that you as a game company can have everything that you would like to provided by the hosting company, because there's still a lot of time towards the game's release.
Yeah.
Because if you knock on a hosting provider's door or cloud provider's door and your game is launching tomorrow, you're not going to get any flexibility or customization. You're going to get what's on their standard portfolio, and that's it. So if you have a game which has quite a bit of complexity, there's even more reason to think about hosting as soon as possible.
Yeah. Can you help as well during testing, like proper like QA moments, if I want to validate if the infrastructure works? How does that work?
Well, that's a good question, because if you test with just a single machine in a single region, you can test some aspects of your game, of course. But before you go towards your alpha stage or beta stage, or even your important play test that you might have with your publisher or your head office, you want to make sure that it also works at scale.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you need to test as well, and not forget, is actual node tests. Going at scale, going into multiple regions, going to see what happens when you can break your game, when you can break your backend.
Yeah.
And that you can only do by testing it at scale. And if you don't do that, it will happen during alpha or beta, but by that time, the public is already involved, because the moment you have an alpha test or beta test, it's always going to get out.
Yeah.
And if your whole backend and hosting strategy is not functioning at that point, you're already kind of too late.
Yeah.
So that's another reason why you should do it early. So yeah, the sizing of your environments, and especially the load tests that you run together, and you can only run that together, of course, when your hosting party is a partner to you, talking directly to your developers, and your developers have access to talk to their staffing and their developers to really get all the information and all the value out of those tests that you do.
Gotcha. Okay. And if I approach a hosting provider like this, so there's a lot of things that you can help me with, right? So how do I check billing? I'm a producer, right? So I'm gonna look at the budget of the game. I'm trying to find a partner that can help me make my game a success. What do I need to pay attention to when it comes to billing structure?
Well, you should start asking them some questions about their capacity availability, especially when you're going to start working with a cloud provider. As an example that you need to be careful of, you might have got off credits earlier during a convention. You think, I can run some time on this for my development environment. But you should realize that when you have a successful game at scale, a cloud provider works just like an infrastructure provider. You're talking about capacity problems, capacity management, that they run out of stock, that you have quotas, you need to suddenly prepay for your service. So be aware that whatever promises are made, you should fact check them and ask the tougher questions to them. Like, what will happen if I need 10,000 servers globally? What is the procedure? What kind of billing structure will it be? How are the payments options? What do we need to do? And what's the time frame that you can deliver it if it's out of stock?
Yeah.
You should really treat the hosting provider where you're going to work with, whether it's a physical one, a cloud one. You really should treat them the same. Yeah. Because you need to punch through the marketing. Because in the game hosting world, when we're talking about 10, 100,000 to sometimes even 10,000 of servers, it is in the end a capacity problem. And at the cloud provider, they're having the same problems that you have with the hosting provider, but it's usually covered by a tiny veil of marketing. And the problem is that when you ignore this, then you're already stuck with them. And then you're forced to pay at their terms. And there's many examples in the games industry over the past 10 years where that has cost a lot of money, because at that point you can no longer switch. When you're not in a position to negotiate when they know that you are their only option.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had that before, where we would choose a partner, and little by little we get more and more features. So we pay for more and more features, and you don't really see the costs pile up. And by that time, it's too late to change.
It's creeping up, and then when you get forced to make that call because your game is, for example, very successful, then you no longer have any option.
Yeah, it costs too much to change the provider. Yeah. So the thing is, everything I do is to make or to help create an amazing player experience. And when it comes to online, we know what it means. We don't want people to stay long in lobbies. We don't want latency. So everything needs to be tailored for that speed. So how do I do with all of the choices that we have with the infrastructure in the world, like the different data centers, the different host types, and the different providers? How do I cut through that, and how do I choose the best solution for my game?
Yeah. First, I totally agree that player experience is key. It's what matters for your game. It matters for the life cycle of your game. If you have happy players, they're more likely to buy your skins, your updates, your expansion packs. So that's the most important thing. So on the infrastructure side, there are a number of components which are important in that regards. First is, of course, the network capacity and latency of the provider that you're picking. Of course, you have a region profile of where your players are going to come from. So you want to make sure that the locations where your provider is providing services to you are actually well-connected locations. So the first things I would do when I'm getting a test server is make sure that I test in every of those locations the connectivity and the latency towards the largest end-user ISPs in those regions. Or maybe the provider already has that data available for me. So that varies, of course, because as you mentioned, there's many different choices out there. The amount of point of presence is, of course, important. Like if you have a game which maybe expects a total amount of players of 1,000, then you're not going to have a lot of regions because people wouldn't be able to matchmake with each other. So you might have a Europe region, America region, the Asia region, for example. But if you have a game which expects 10,000, 100,000, or even more concurrent players, then 3 points of presence is not going to cut it. That's more probably you will need like 30 or more different locations to be able to provide an optimal experience for all your players. It also depends on the type of game that you're making.
Okay.
Because some games, usually the first-person shooters, really depend on having that low latency for the optimal network performance. But if a game is more co-op mode, cooperative without low latency, real-time statistics involved or esports involved, then lower latency is not a hard requirement. It's still nice, but it's not a hard requirement. So you can do with a little bit less point of presence. Or maybe you're making a game which has cloud streaming elements. And then, of course, you'll want to be within 30 milliseconds or less towards all of your players worldwide. So to achieve that, you will need a provider with a lot of points of presence. So there's also this thing, of course, about the hardware itself.
Yeah.
Or maybe that's also an argument against matching many different providers together, because you might end up with many different kinds of hardware. Means that you have to individually test all these hardware with your game server and redo the optimization on each of them. So ideally, you want to work with a party which can offer you standardized hardware, which will be the same on all the points of presence that they are, like 1 or maybe 2 different kind of models. Because in the end, that's going to save you a lot of work with optimization, debugging, and also the load testing. Yeah. And then the small things like, let's say you have your game builds, and let's say you have a couple of thousand services with one of these providers. How are you going to distribute them to these servers? And also, how are you going to distribute these towards your players? So, if I would always look for a provider which provides some additional services as well, such as a content distribution or a game orchestration platform, which can help you with making that easier to distribute these kind of patches and binaries.
What are other crucial parameters of the infrastructure you will need to pay attention to?
So, and looking at the package as a whole, you should definitely look at the connectivity, both locally, as I mentioned earlier, but also between the different regions. Because depending on the matchmaking rules and the size of your player pool, it could very well be, especially during the later hours or during the day itself, that players might be playing together from different regions. Of course, during prime time, there should be enough players, but when the play curve is going down, or early in the midday when it's still going up, it could very well be that from different regions, players will be playing together. So it's also important how the connectivity is from, for example, Eastern Europe towards Rotterdam, if you look at our data center here, just as important as it is from Germany or France to Rotterdam. So you should also be testing that and looking at that to ensure that your players will have the best experience. The second part is you can have low latency, but you can still have packet loss.
Okay.
So packet loss happens when the line between the data center and the end user's ISP is congested at somewhere along the route. And yes, the distance could still be very small, so the latency would be low, but at certain point of the day, usually the evenings, it could be congested, and then a number of the packets in transit, and the game usually uses UDP, they get lost, they never get recovered, and for a player, it experiences a rubber banding. You think you might kill someone, but then you're not. It's a very frustrating experience, and that's definitely something that you want to take with you in your evaluation and testing of a provider. And then it's the thing, especially in competitive games, or when there's a Twitch stream going on of a popular Twitch guy or girl switching to your game with their 100,000 followers. There's a lot of DDoS happening in gaming.
Yep.
From either malign script kiddies to the professional extortionists who will do nothing but try to get your whole game offline in a region or maybe even globally. So you should check what kind of tooling your provider has for that. Is it just generic tooling where they do rerouting your game traffic to another scrubbing center, which for the majority of games is very bad, because by then usually the connection is already terminated. Do they have any inline filtering? Do they have anything especially for UDP traffic? Do they have blacklisting, whitelisting systems maybe for your game join ports? Those are all things that you should question and talk about, because it's extremely important for your game, because your game's released, everyone is playing it, but this is not in place, and an actor can simply remove a whole region of capacity by attacking it within a few minutes. Then as the player, you might be disconnected and thrown out of the game multiple times in the evening. Well, that might happen one evening, but if it happens a few evenings, that player is never going to touch your game again, and it's a lost opportunity. So it should definitely be something to keep in mind. And then
also because I think the video game world is it's the trade against the most anti-DDoS attacks, right? Because people kind of love targeting tires. And
there's a lot of emotion going on in the games as well, and especially when you're losing or winning. The boundary to then do the attack, or as I like to call it, there's always people enjoy ruining someone else's sandcastle. This is definitely true in gaming, so we see a lot of it. And then finally, one thing is that there might be a great network, there might be almost no packet loss, but does your hosting provider have actually real relationships with all these important end user ISPs? Do they have someone there that they can talk to if something is wrong? And if they need an escalation or an investigation into why the performance is, for example, not going well. Normally, I would say this in the professional terms, you would say our peering relationships of the provider with the end user ISP. So they have a lot of direct connections to these end user ISPs. Do they have a lot of network engineering in place in the network, in their backbone, with the BGP communities, and how they can selectively steer and improve the network if the situation asks for it? Or is the provider which needs to send a ticket to their own network engineering team, and then it takes 3 weeks to take place? These are a little bit harder to test. You need to really think of some specific situations to ask them. But you need to figure out how responsive their backbone team or their network engineering is to any of a real-life situation happening. Just look, for example, at the war with Russia and Ukraine. In the beginning, that severely disrupted the internet routing and traffic towards the whole Eastern Europe. And as a hosting provider, you needed to be on the ball with your network to route around it and make sure that it kept working.
it sounds like then it's really important to, if you want to provide that kind of service, that you are owning the full stack in a way, right? Because it's not just the service. Now you're telling me about the network and the peering relationships as well.
I totally agree. For in the end, again, player experience is key. And you as the producer want to have an answer as soon as possible what is going on. You want the data, you want the insights, so you can tell the 𝗥𝗲𝗃𝗀𝗃 with pitchforks on Twitter, Reddit, or wherever they are, what's going on, what's happening, and what will be the resolution time, if anything. So from the hosting provider's point of view, you can only do that if you are in control of your complete stack, from the data center towards the whole level on top, to the servers, to the software, to the network, and everything in between, really. So the also for the network, the less parties that are between you and the end user, the easier it is to debug and escalate and find out what the problem is.
Yeah, absolutely.
If also the hardware is under your own control, you can immediately know what's going on, what is wrong. If you have the direct contacts with all of these data centers that you will know what is happening if there's a power outage or a heating problem or anything else going on, because you are the direct contact, the contract person of these entities. So again, if you have control of the complete stack, you have the ability to respond a lot quicker to your customer incidents and to your customers' questions, to give them the feedback that they need to have from their players. In a normal corporate enterprise environment, a turnaround time of 1, 2, or even 3 weeks to a simple question is not that uncommon. In gaming, however, you want that within minutes or less. Ideally, you want it as soon as possible. You want to be able to reach out to your provider on Slack, to someone knowledgeable who can give you insight on what is going on. And I believe, that's where we offer a very unique proposition.
Yeah, it's interesting for me as well, because if the hosting doesn't work, like if for some reason my players cannot connect, I already need to take a bit of time to investigate, is it down to a certain platform? Is it my game build?
Is it your own backend or your own services? And usually by the time you reach out to the hosting provider, you're pretty sure
it's them.
It's somewhere there. And you don't want to go through 5 different hoops and 7 different ticket systems to finally be able to reach someone who can give you information.
Yeah, because it's so complex, and that's the reason why I want to go to a third party for those, because it's I feel like I'm opening a Pandora's box, and my team won't have the knowledge for this, nor the time to take care of it. So it's good that I have people to look at all these other elements to help me. You
want your hosting provider to be that partner, and also a knowledge partner with you, to help you there and work as a team together with you. The worst situation you can be in if you are seen by your provider as just another client, as a number, and then if you have a problem, that they are not there for you.
Yeah, that's actually a bit scary, because so like I said, I worked with very big companies, but also small ones, and it's very it's frightening to think that might happen, that you just might be a tiny client that people would dedicate only so little time to, when it could be very important, or also the game could explode as well. So what do I do if I have a small game and then on release, bam, it just explodes?
Yeah, I mean, that's also why I always say that even a small studio and a small game first is still a very important client, because the next day it could very well be that the game has exploded, and it's then the next big thing that everyone wants to play.
Yeah.
So for us, whether it's a big corporate publisher or a small indie studio, we all have the same passion for gaming and making sure that the player gets the best experience possible. And that means also working with all our different clients and also treating them as them all being very important. And because we've been in this business for 20 plus years, we are very much aware of the kind of problems that they face. And we understand the problems that they face. So that's why we are able to act on them.
Yeah. It's the other thing, it reminds me of a bit of something that's kind of I need to pay attention to when I'm working with very small clients is, of course, there's a lot of things we can't do because we have small teams. So we're going to be using a lot of different tools.
Yep.
So how do I make sure as well that my infrastructure and my hosting provider works with the different tools? Because that's a lot of different technologies I need to plugin together, for instance, the anti-DDoS? How do I do it?
So it's very normal nowadays that, especially as a game designer or publisher or studio, that you integrate and operate with many different tools and many different kind of services or SaaS-based platforms. So one thing, of course, to look at what's the tool availability, what kind of resources does your hosting provider provide to you to be able to talk to them in an automated way, like, for example, API endpoints, and what's the amount of effort that I need to do to be able to integrate with these kind of systems, and what would be the effort be to not integrate with these systems. So one of the first questions that usually then comes to mind when I'm looking at other hosting providers or platforms, what's the ease of integration? Do they have SDKs available, general ones, or even based in the agents, like in Unreal or Unity? And how easy is it to integrate this in my game? How much development time do I need to spend to start using this platform? And of course, from a hosting provider's point of view, I want to make that time needed as small as possible. But from a game development point of view, you want to make sure that the integration that it offers, of course, doesn't take a lot of development time, but that you're also fully aware of what does it mean if I'm integrated here.
Yes.
Is it good? Well, can I integrate away from it if needed? What are the advantages that it offers me? For example, in our case, I would claim the advantages are if you integrate with us. We have a very transparent bare metal layer of these services, and you can bring even your own cloud accounts if you have them.
Nice.
So you can use them to use for your bursting capacity. So yes, you have a bit of a lock-in with us, but there's full transparency along the process. That's not always the case with other SaaS platforms, and that's definitely something that you need to be aware of.
So what kind of decisions does my studios need to do when they're looking at hardware configuration then?
Yeah. So it kind of depends on what the development stage is of your game, where you're at right now. Because the most important thing which decides your hosting infrastructure is how much are you going to have server authority in your game. So how much is this game server going to be deciding what is real and what is not real in terms of actions, for example. Is the game server going to decide if someone hits another player? Is the game server going to decide where the player really is on the map or not? Or is the client all going to be deciding that? So that means that players can modify it if they have it on the client. But if it's a cooperative shooter without any eSport elements, that might be a sane choice to do.
Yeah.
And then in that case, you might have a game server component, which is nothing more than just a simple net puncher connecting different people together.
Yeah.
And that's about it. That also means it's extremely lightweight. That means you can host it on probably the cheapest server possible and put a lot of those instances on it. But if you have a first-person shooter with sports elements, an MMO, or any other large-scale game, then your game server is going to be quite resource demanding. And as such, your hardware profile is going to be completely different. It would mean that one of those cheaper machines where there's many of in today's world at every single provider that you are would be unavailable because they could not handle the minimum loads that your game server process would then need. So server authority is the biggest thing. And during the game design process, you need to be aware of that and keep it in mind, because what your game designers might want might have big implications for that hosting footprint.
Yeah.
And that mindset is not usually there at the game designers.
Yeah.
They just want the best game.
Yeah.
And
with cool features and play can do this and that in real time.
And if you have the discussion with them at that point already, that means you can avoid having a lot of development time wasted on something which you would never be able to afford later on and would have to be scrapped.
Yeah, that's
so that's one of the main things I always talk about. And then you look at the actual game server. So you start looking at during the game session, how long is the game session on average? Is it going to be 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 15 minutes, or 24/7? Does the game server end after each session and gets recycled for a new allocation? Or is the game server which runs 24/7 and always switches to a new map, a new map, a new map? which in today's world is a very inefficient way of hosting your game, because that game server will never be able to get killed that easily as a game server which ends its match and terminates itself after every session. That means if all the game servers are done, they're terminated, then you can scale down the machine or VM and only start a new one if there's actually player demand for it. Another important thing to consider is the network utilization of your game. Whereas on hosting providers which work with physical infrastructure, the network traffic is usually not so much of a concern. For the cloud portion of your game, for your bursts and so forth, the bandwidth costs can be extreme. So that's why it's very important to look at your game server processes and the bandwidth utilization and take it into account for your forecasting and your budgets, and also how you plan to do your distribution between cloud providers and physical infrastructure providers.
So just to make sure I understand, here you mean also like the number of requests we're sending to the servers and how big they are in a way?
Yes, back and forth. So both the upload and download per client, because usually that gets counted up together when this looking at how much bandwidth.
I think it's becoming a big subject as well in terms of sustainability for the servers, because that requires more energy. So we need to streamline the code of the game in a way, and these queries to make sure that they have a low footprint in a way.
Yes, there's also, but I mentioned, of course, that when game servers have a set session time and then they stop, then you can terminate the server or power off the server until it's needed again. So that's also a form of sustainability that to keep in mind. But also optimizing your game server to be less resource hungry and less resource intensive means that in the end you will use a lot less. Your carbon footprint will be a lot smaller per player if you optimize your game server really, really, really well. So yes, it's becoming more and more of a topic. And of course, when you're a very small indie game development studio and your projected CCU is going to be a couple of thousands, you're not going to save a lot of that. But if we're going to talk numbers where you are running 10,000 plus servers and just a small efficiency gain there, will save not just a lot of money, but also a significant carbon footprint reduction, which in today's world is becoming more and more important, not from a reporting point of view.
So we've talked about how do I choose my hosting provider, what kind of things I need to pay attention to. We've talked about the infrastructure side, we've talked about the hardware side. So now my next question for my team is usually, okay, but what kind of hosting strategy do I use?
Yeah, that's a very good question. There are a number of strategies that you can use. Of course, if you look back at the past couple of years, there's three main ones which we see. One is that you put everything on physical infrastructure. It could very well be that you might even have your own data centers if you're in a very large game studio, or already existing capacity that you used for previous games that you can simply reuse. That one is a bit out of favor nowadays because not a lot of game studios have a significant amount of own personal infrastructure anymore, or their own data centers. So what we also see is the other extreme, where game studios or publishers put everything in a single cloud provider.
It's very fashionable these days,
And that's also kind of putting all your eggs in a single basket, which we'll cover, of course, later. And then we see the hybrid mode, which is usually a combination of a physical infrastructure layer at one of the hosting providers, and then preferably multiple cloud providers to deal with the burst. And that's what I see the most nowadays in the current industry.
So it's very fashionable these days to go with cloud hosting. Everyone loves it. Can you tell me a bit more why? So,
of course, what cloud does really well is offer convenience, or at least the idea of convenience and the idea of flexibility. And of course, they do that really well. The marketing is really good, and they keep developing new kind of layers which are really convenient for developers to use. Of course, cloud 10 years ago, cloud was virtualized servers. And nowadays they have containers on top of them, and nowadays on top of that they have again serverless. And what most people don't realize when they, for example, use serverless, is in the background the cloud provider spins up a container which might be running on a virtual server, which might still be running on a physical server. And at every level of convenience, there's more margin that you pay towards this cloud provider. So that convenience has a price, and that's kind of the downside of working with a cloud provider. The costs can get out of control really quickly.
Yes.
Well, of course, also the advantage that you can start small and easily scale up. But when we're talking about game service, which especially like also with a movie, the first few months usually have the peak usage, and then the game kind of dwindles down into your next release or content update. The cost can go out of control really quickly. And I have also many examples that the clouds are not as flexible as they would like to say. So when you're talking about thousands and thousands of servers, it's the same way they're talking about commit spans, yearly commits, locations being unavailable to you that you need to work around with. And if you have all your eggs in one basket with a single cloud provider and also are deeply integrated with them, they will know it and they will dictate the terms that you have to pay to.
Also, I get less wiggle room for my negotiation.
Get less wiggling room. And so that's definitely a warning sign, and that's why many parties did wake up and thought, okay, we should at least maybe consider using multiple clouds so we can offset that a little bit. But then there's usually the problem that you are deeply integrated with one, and then the first question is, how do you get out and find a way or a platform so you can use multiple cloud providers easily?
Yeah. It also feels a bit intuitive to go with different providers so that if one of them, for some reason, there's an outage somewhere, which has happened, then I get a backup with the other one. So that would be another reason why I would want to.
Yes, definitely. It's also for disaster scenarios. Especially the past year has proven that every single cloud out there can go down.
Yeah.
Not just once, multiple times per year. So that's why it's good to spread your eggs in multiple baskets, so to say. But it's also not always an easy challenge from an engineering point of view. I understand that. When I talk to customers and they've been working with a cloud provider for 5 or 10 years.
Yeah.
They are deeply integrated. Then there's a lot of hurdles to get out of that ecosystem. And by then they usually know it and might even regret it. But yeah, that's also the way it is. Yeah.
Thanks. So these are like the advantages and the disadvantages of cloud. That's one thing. But you also mentioned bare metals. Can you tell me more about this one?
Yeah. So especially right now, bare metals offer you a significant cost advantage, especially for the capacity that's going to be running more than, for example, a half a day or more at the same time. Of course, if you have very short burst loads, like a little bit in the evening and on a month total, it might run for like a couple of days at most, then using multiple cloud providers to spread that burst is the most cost-effective way to go. But for everything else, you should really consider hosting that on the physical bare metal infrastructure, because the cost advantages there are so significant that it's really, you're really hurting your bottom line if you do not consider this. And it's not just cost, because we all know that with all the big hyperscaler competition going on right now, that in 5 or 10 years from now, that cost difference will probably be smaller, because we see cost competition happening between the cloud providers to try and buy market share. So there's also the added advantages of working with the same partner, with the bare metals on all these locations, having the network connectivity together with it, having the support staff, the relationship. Because I'm not sure how your experience is, but my experience when working with the hyperscalers is that I'm just a number.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just a client. And I have never spoken to someone actually working at the engineering departments there. You're always talking to just the account manager at best. So it's a whole package that you have to consider. And I would definitely always advise going with a mix. Go with bare metal, cloud for your burst, and that's what now commonly is referred to as the hybrid model.
Yeah.
But yes, I do have to agree with bare metals. You lose some of the flexibility that you have with the cloud provider. So you should choose what is best for your game. And I cannot stress again that you should always consider your base layer and your burst.
Yeah. Well, So kind of having an idea of what's the minimum number of players I'm expecting at all times. That would be my bare metals.
Yeah.
It would be stable and cheap. And then if I want more, there's a peak. If I'm doing a promotion, then I burst into the cloud.
Yes, and definitely do it with multiple cloud providers.
Gotcha. Thanks, Stefan. So from what I hear, so I need to pay attention to the infrastructure and what kind of partner I'm going for, my strategy as well. Can you give me a bit of a summary? Like, so again, I'm looking for the best provider. How would you make the checklist look like?
So if I would be developing a game right now, these are the main points that I would want to keep in mind.
Yeah.
First, for the hosting strategy, go hybrid. No question about it. Work with a game orchestration platform which supports multiple cloud providers for your bursting and has a base layer of bare metal machines there for you. There's also, of course, think about your play experience. Do your due diligence. Check the network connectivities. Do your research for your own regions. Where do you expect your players to be? Which decides where do you need your capacity to be. Think really good during your game design what decisions you want to be made on the server side of things, which are client side of things, and also research them well to determine the impact of those decisions. And make sure that the provider you work with knows gaming, and that they are reachable and accessible, not just by you as the producer, but also by your developers and engineers to talk directly to their team, that they can give you good, accurate information that you need at that time to give back to your players or your other internal stakeholders. So you really need to look for a partner, and there's quite a few of these kind of companies out there, but of course, I believe 𝗥𝗲𝗹𝗲𝘃 can do that very well.
Think over all of these different aspects of the, or answer all of these questions for my team.
Yeah, I think we can cover all of them. We have a proven track record over the past 20 years of working with both very large studios, but also very small indies.
Nice.
And I think we all have gaming in our DNA. The whole reason why the company was even started was because we were annoyed with the bad player experience that we're having. When we're playing these old games back in the days, the Unreal 99s, the Call of Duties, the early Counter-Strikes, that we weren't getting the player experience that we expected. And that's still driving us 20 years later.
Nice. One of the things I was also a bit wondering, so I used to work for publishers as well, and I'm currently working with different teams. Can we all go to 𝗥𝗲𝗹𝗲𝘃? Does it matter like the size, the engine that we use, the tools that we use?
Well, the nice part about working with us, that the tech that you use, we're generally agnostic. If your game uses, for example, an allocation flow-based model, of course we support it. It's the most common model that we see nowadays. If your game is still more traditional, where the player needs to join through a server browser, that's also something we can work with. We support that you can run all your site applications on every single physical machine and VM. So you can run your own tooling, your own information gathering, or access our own tooling that our platform provides to you. So the main word that pops in my head when I think about us in the relation to your integration is flexibility. We try to give you as much flexibility as possible, so you can integrate us with your internal systems in the way that works best for you.
Gotcha. And does it matter how well my tech team knows about infrastructure and network gaming and online?
It doesn't matter at all. We are working with clients who have very large online teams, and they automate everything. They create beautiful dashboards, better ones than that I have. It's impressive what they managed to do with that. But we also have very small teams where we help a lot, assist them a lot. We've also working with teams where we do the whole game lifecycle management. So we do all the patches, the deploys, everything.
Nice.
So again, it comes down to flexibility and what you are looking for as your game team. And as a producer or in a publishing organization, you have very different kind of game teams with different kind of staffing, different kind of budgets, and different kind of needs.
Yeah.
And we try to be a partner to each of them.
Nice. Thank you.
Thank you.